Okay. All right, so if this is your introduction to gray whales, if you are just now discovering these wonderful creatures that actually come into Puget Sound, which a lot of people don't expect that to be the case, I'm just going to do a really quick Gray Whale 101 while we're waiting for John to finish up with the film crew on the beach and come up and join us. So the gray whales have one of the longest migrations of any mammal on Earth. They are migrating from the Bering and Chukchi Seas, actually further north than you see on the map here. Actually, they go up through the Aleutians, further north, to feed in the winter. And then they travel down to Baja California, and that's where their breeding season is. So these animals have a breeding and feeding season when they are migrating. Typically, they don't eat. And they need to have enough food stored on board to make that migration all the way down to Baja and back. And if they don't, then they're going to start looking for food along the way. So the Sounders gray whales that we have here, these are animals who have come in looking for food and discovered that we have this magical ghost shrimp situation here in Saratoga Pass and the Snohomish River Delta. And that's why they keep coming back, because they've figured out this special spot. Yeah. Oops. You can't back it up, can you? Thank you. All right. So this red area shows you the general area where the sounders hang out, and especially at a lower tide when they can't come in to feed in the shallow water, they really love this spot down here around Hat Island and the Snohomish River Delta, which also happens to be right next to one of the biggest marinas in Puget Sound. And personally, one of the reasons that I love what Orca Network does is because we're trying to educate boaters about correct behavior around gray whales. You can see in this picture the surfacing of this whale. They're really easy to miss if you're not looking for them. They're not like orcas with a big tall fin. So these folks are at a much greater risk of ship strikes than some other whales. And when we have a lot of boats racing in and out of that marina, that can be a problem. And there have been some incidents and some very close calls there. So I just wanted to take a quick second to go over the current regulations for gray whales here. There's been a lot of talk about orca regulations, but the gray whales also have their own set. The law is that we need to stay a minimum of 100 yards away from gray whales. And the best practice is to slow down to 7 knots or less whenever you see a whale in the area. Gray whales don't echolocate, so they can hear the boats, but they're not relying on sound to find out about their environment quite the same way that the toothed whales do. And we want to make sure we give them plenty of space. We're not leapfrogging ahead of them to have them come to us. We don't want to cut them off, especially if they're heading into shore during an incoming tide. And these are just some images on the screen right now that show you what you might see if you're out there in a boat. You might see the tail flukes above the water, the dorsal ridge. They don't have a dorsal fin. Heart-shaped blow when they come to the surface. And when they're feeding in shallow water, sometimes they'll lift up their pectoral fin. You might even see a piece of the tail fluke. And people are often a little, if they're seeing it for the first time, they don't know what that is. That's what you're seeing, is a gray whale on its side feeding in the shallow water. So at the Baja end of things, they also have a set of regulations. This picture was taken during a trip I was fortunate enough to go on recently to Laguna San Ignacio in Baja, where we go out in these little boats, and the friendly gray whales, they've learned from their mothers that they can approach the boats and people will interact with them. And so you have the opportunity to actually interact with these animals legally in the setting. And so this person couldn't quite reach the whale in this picture, but we all did get a chance to have that kind of interaction, which is really an amazing thing. And this is a trip that we do every year through Orca Network. So if you have questions about that, let me know. I can pass you on to the right people. We saw lots of spy hopping too. There's some behaviors that you see in the lagoon that you don't necessarily see here. However, I wanted to talk about the rules in Baja as well. So this is what the community itself has come up with. The lagoon itself was going to be turned into salt mines, but the fishers who live there saw this behavior in the whales, and they came together to create this sanctuary. It's now the largest sanctuary in Latin America. And in this particular reserve, there's a very small area where people are allowed to have these interactions with the whales. There's a limited number of boats that go into the area at a time. There is a very strict 90-minute observation period, and I can tell you from experience, if you are even a minute over, they're on the radio telling you it's time to get out. There's only whale watching from 8 to 5, and only 2 boats are allowed with the friendlies at a time. They also don't fish in the lagoon during this time. The rest of the year, the people who are driving these boats out for the tourists to come and interact with the whales, they are the ones who are fishing in the lagoon. So they have a lot of stake in maintaining this area. Hi, John, welcome. And so it's an amazing thing that they have created to make sure that the whales here are safe and not harassed when they are present. And here's a spy hop right here in Saratoga Pass. So we see some of the same behaviors here. Just want to share that, the whales, it's the same whales and they do some of the same things. And we're really lucky that we have the opportunity to view them closely from shore here, but not everyone does. And with that, I am happy to turn the mic over to our special guests, the pioneers of gray whale research. Do we have Jim Darling online? Okay, so Jim Darling and John Calambokidis, who just walked in. So we're going to get him mic'd up. And so just a couple minutes and we will begin the presentations with them. Thank you once again, everyone, for being here. And we're going to go ahead and let Jim go ahead and get started with his presentation now.
Well, hi, can you hear me?
Welcome, Jim.
Thank you. I presume you're hearing me. Yes? Can you just let me know if you're hearing me fine?
Yes.
Yes.
You sound good. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'm not sure where to start here. I read the info saying I was going to talk about history for a bit, which I will try to do in a minute. But just a couple of days ago, one of the whale watching folks here texted me, and said, we just found Harmony again. Harmony is a female which was first identified in 1975 here, so that's 50 years of returning to this area along the west coast of the island. And, as I was thinking about that, that pretty much says it all. I mean, we'll talk more about Harmony in a minute, but the fact that we have females, at least 50 years old, that have been returning here each year for what must be all of their lives. And she has a number of associates and other females, which are probably the pillars or the core of this particular population, which we've worked on for years. But before I get into that, thank you for inviting me or re-inviting me. I know I've been invited a few times and had to decline. This is just normally a really busy time of, well, even now it's a really busy time of year, but because we're just generally finishing up in Hawaii at this time. And the last couple of years, for a bunch of different reasons, we've been finishing in Hawaii a little bit early. So I'm glad things finally lined up and I could join you. Also, it's important that I acknowledge that just like all of these studies, and I'm sure John will be the first one to agree, is lots of people, make them happen. People supporting and assisting, and in many cases actually leading different parts of the studies. And just to name a few here, some of you will know these folks as Josie Cleland and Kate Coe and Tammy Steves and geneticist Tim Fraser. All have been working on this project for a number of years. And as far as ID pictures go, which, as you well know, is the basis of just about everything these days, is the most recent sort of catalog we put together. We had 28 different photographers that had done IDs over the years. This work along the west coast of Vancouver Island, and particularly in Clayoquot Sound, has been funded for decades now by whale watching companies. the ones that I need to mention are Remote Passages and Jamie's, although there are several others which, um, help us whenever and however they can. So this is very much a community project here. It's administered through Pacific Wildlife Foundation in Vancouver, which is a descendant of West Coast Whale, which was one of our organizations which we started in the 1980s. So on the history part of this, I can tell you my history. We do need to acknowledge, of course, the First Nations history here is more in terms of thousands of years old, whereas mine is a few decades. And indeed, details of the First Nations involvement with the whales here were one of the studies which Tim Fraser and his students looked at through ancient DNA, from whale bones and middens. And I don't want to sort of get into this now, but it was pretty fascinating. I mean, among other things, they were able to identify the species. And it was about 50% gray whales, 50% humpbacks, but we were also finding finbacks and right whales, which raised all kinds of questions. But the easier part for me, I began in the early 70s. I was in biology, but had no thoughts of whales at the time. That is biology at school. But we'd always head out to the west coast of Vancouver Island in the summertime to go surfing, and this required a job of some kind. And to make this briefer, I ended up in 1972 running well, it wasn't a whale watching boat. It was a boat called the Sea Lion Cruise. And it took people off the beach to go out and look at sea lions around some rocks. And it was called the Sea Lion Cruise because no one would dare call it a whale watch because no one expected we would see whales here. And we found, as we were doing that day after day through the summer, feeding gray whales virtually every day. I mean, 95% of the time. And being in biology, I thought, gee, I would go to the library. Back then, you had to go to the library and read something about them so as I could tell the tourists. And all I read was that they were not supposed to be there. I mean, there was just no hint that these whales should be off Vancouver Island in the middle of the summer. Now, there had been a few hints in the 60s of whale sightings, along the coast all the way from Northern California to Vancouver Island in the summertime. But and certainly the local folks, the crab fishermen especially, were well aware that there were whales here. And some provincial park naturalists way back in the 60s, if you read their field notes, they were noting whales were around. So, whales were sighted here, but there was no sort of context to try to quite figure out what was going on. So around, well, then it got interesting. This is one last point I'll make here on the history is about that time in the early 70s, a guy named Dave Hattler, who from my point of view was, as an undergraduate, was a wise old PhD student at UBC. He was doing his PhD here on mink, but because the national park was sort of coming together, among other things, he was doing some, the initial seabird surveys and marine mammal surveys and land mammal surveys in the park. And he was out in the Zodiac offshore a lot, and he started photographing gray whales he was running into. And I think he was mainly intrigued with the birds following him around. But eventually, later in 1972, for some reason, I can't remember the details here, I was having supper at his apartment at UBC, and right in the middle of supper, he asked, he knew I had been out on the sea lion watching boat, asked me if there were any whales I saw, which I, recognized more than once. And I said, yeah, there was one with this giant orange scar on its side. And that's as far as I got before he sort of jumped up off the table, ran to the closet, pulled the door open, and pulled all this stuff off the sort of top shelf in the closet, and everything tumbled out, including a bunch of slide boxes. I don't know if anybody even remembers those, but anyway, he fingered through them, pulled out a photograph, showed it to me, and sure enough, it was the orange-scarred whale, which we'd seen, I'd been seeing as I was looking for sea lions in 72. And the only thing is he took the picture in 1970. So he got pretty excited. We didn't have a picture from 1972, but that year or the following season, I managed to get a camera and a little boat and got out there and was going to find this whale if it was the last thing I did. And sure enough, in 1973, we were able to find this orange-scored whale again. Now, he realized the importance of this. I'm not sure I did. I was 22 at the time and wasn't entirely focused on what we were doing, but he felt that it was worth writing a paper, preparing a paper, which, he did most of the work of. And that was the first paper, which was published, I think, in 1974, which indicated that not only were whales seen off the West Coast, we had the same whales, same individuals seen over a number of years. So in 73, when I was out looking for the orange-scarred whale, I pretty much took pictures of everything which moved, all the different patterns on the whales. And we still didn't really have any idea what we were doing, but it seemed like an interesting thing to be pursuing. And fortunately, I had an ally across the island in Mike Bigg, who I'm sure you all know who that is, as he was at that point still early on in identifying individual killer whales. And I remember taking over, a few of my pictures, which were on one of those, those album pages where you have a sticky sheet, and I'd put a bunch of color prints in there and put the sticky sheet over it. And I went to Nanaimo and I saw Mike and I said, hey, I think we can identify these things. And fortunately, he agreed immediately and said, get out there and keep doing it, which was at that time fairly unique response, as this idea that you could identify individuals was not immediately accepted. In fact, in some cases, there was a fair bit of derision around it. So that's my history in this. And you just fast forward here 40 years or 40, 50 years, and we end up with Harmony, which was first identified in those early years and is still here along with, say, a lot of our associates. So up to recent, and I'm just going to mention a couple things here. A few years ago, we figured it was okay, time. It was time to sort of take all this information and see if we could, summarize it. What I mean is, we had umpteen years of photographs and 3 or 4 different catalogs, which were put together for different reasons. And we figured we'd, pull them all apart and integrate them all. And I'm sorry about the dog. Yeah, he's going to cooperate, I hope. And all of these different observations and genetic samples and all kinds of stuff, which built up over the 40 plus years. And we developed a catalog which included all of those things, which, is now around. I don't know if you can see it. It's this one. We also, or Josie also created a relational database, which allowed us to insert information that we had on all the different individuals and allowed us to ask a lot of very specific questions like, is so-and-so whale, how many times was it in a particular feeding ground in August over, the last 10 years, those kinds of questions. This first catalog we did, there's actually 2. The one I just showed you is the whales which we've seen over multiple years. In other words, they had to show up at least 1 year, and in some cases 20, 30, and 40 years. In that case, there's 183 individuals, or there was when we finished this catalog, which is a couple of years ago. And as I think you probably all realize, the minute you publish one of these catalogs, it's out of date within a few weeks as people send in more pictures and that kind of thing. But it wasn't 183 individuals that we had information on for that catalog. We have another catalog which is not published, which is the 1 years, the whales which we see just in one season, don't see again. And there's about 400 individuals in that. And of course, the 1 years can turn into multi-years at any time with another photograph. Now, I have to admit that I've not finished writing a lot of this stuff up. It's probably about 70% done. And then I got sidelined in the last few years on another project on humpback whales. And I'm beginning to feel quite guilty that I haven't completed this summary that we're working on. However, just a few bits and pieces of information, which gives you an indication of what we're able to sort of discern over this time, is of those whales we have identified in multiple years. We have 36 known males and 46 known females, and these are determined both by whether or not they had a calf and DNA. Over those years, we have 18 mothers and 24 births. If we include the 2021 data and a few others, we've got 18 mothers and 23 births, 25 births, that should be. Anyway, the youngest mother's age is 13 years old. It was a calf when we first identified it, born in 2002, had its first calf in 2015. The shortest span between calves was 2 years. A whale named Elvis had calves in both 2014 and 2016. The longest observed span between calves was 17 years, although that's a bit of a, that doesn't mean much, being that we're just looking at a window of their, summer range, and being that they're weaning their calves by August, if they don't happen to pass by our cameras before August, they may well have had calves which have been weaned. So, however, from our information, the longest observed span between calves was 17 years. And then we have two examples, and this is what to me is most interesting, of 3 generations of whales which have come back. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. We have one whale, the grandmother, was first identified in 1975 and seen through 2004. And the age that it gave birth to the next generation, it was at least 29 years old. The next generation, which is the mother, was born in 2002. We have seen her every year from 2002 to 2019. And then she gave birth at age 12, and her calf was born in 2015. There's another one, a grandmother, which we saw in 1994. The mother was actually, we saw the grandmother the same year the mother was born. So the mother was born in 1994. The span was 2000 that we've seen here was 1994 to 2019. The age that she gave birth was 21, and her calf was born in 2019. So that just, gives you an idea of the kind of information that we're able to, or have been able to sort of put together. There's a ton more, but
Jim, can you clarify the geographical range your research is done with for our audience?
Sure. The question is, can I clarify? I probably should have started with that. I presumed you all being so close.
Yeah, well, and I'm not, we have people.
It's no, it's the west coast of Vancouver Island. I live in Tofino. All of the work is done in Tofino. So depending on the distance and how good the weather is and everything else, it's, we often are up as far as Estevan Point and Nootka Island, which is, 50 miles further north, and also south to Long Beach and Barkley Sound, and to some extent down the West Coast Trail and towards Victoria. But the study itself is based out of Tofino. I was thinking,
Jim,
can
you hear me, Jim?
Yeah.
This is John. I just thought, as you chat, I might jump in and just join you on a couple of points of things you raised, just to have a little dialogue. One of the things that I thought was interesting in what you were saying about your start was bringing up Mike Bigg, and I think people are always familiar with him from killer whale fame, if you will. And it's interesting hearing the connection you had with him related to gray whales. And I had an early connection with Mike Bigg that just kind of shows the breadth of what he did, because I met with him in the late 70s because my start was looking at harbor seals. And he did one of the really important papers on clinal patterns in the pupping season of harbor seals along the West Coast. So I really, wanted to connect with him about harbor seals at that time. And it was really valuable to talk to him and get insights on that. But I just like the different ways that he influenced things outside of just the killer whale world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was one of the, say the few, maybe the only DFO, fellow who would call me up on a regular basis and ask how he could help me,
Right.
which, is unusual from the government at times.
Yeah, he set a real model for so many of us.
Right.
Maybe I can make just a couple of quick points here, and then it'll kind of give us a chance to have a little dialogue on a few things that would be good. I was just my connection to gray whales actually began because of harbor seals, because the early studies that I was working on started in '76 focused on contaminants in harbor seals. And so we were looking at the impacts that they had. And during the late 70s, I don't know if you recall this, there were these series of strandings of gray whales in Puget Sound, something we now understand much better. But when those gray whales washed up in Puget Sound, it became a great deal of kind of question of whether contaminants were part of it. Part of the thinking was gray whales feed on the bottom. Some of these contaminants like PCBs concentrate in the sediment. Could these gray whales, by coming into Puget Sound, be exposed to toxic levels of contaminants? And that's why they were dying. And I think one of the people, a veterinarian at the time, was quoted, I think in the Seattle Times, that gray whales were dying of a toxic soup in Puget Sound. And that's what actually got my interest going at that time. And that's what led me to become familiar with your work on the west coast of Vancouver Island and try to understand gray whales better and what they were doing here. So anyway, I just wanted to get that little intro in, and maybe we can just keep going back and forth. I didn't want to interrupt where you were at either.
Oh, I'm sort of done. I think I'm sure we'll end up discussing food eventually here, but as we all know, no food, no whales, and
Yeah.
there's probably a few things to discuss on that front. But
Absolutely. When you, in the 70s, when you were doing your work off Vancouver Island, I know to us the interesting question, we started to do surveys in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and that's where we became interested, were some of those whales also returning every summer. And I think the fascinating part of what Jim discovered was that these were the same whales coming back. There had been papers in the past in the literature about, what were called out of season gray whales along the West Coast that would be seen outside the migration periods when, everything said gray whales breed in these lagoons in Baja, and then they migrate up to the Arctic, and that's their feeding area. And so whales that were seen outside that migration period were kind of considered out of season or summering whales. And maybe that's part of you've seen this evolution what to call these whales that Jim documented. And I'm going to ask you in a second a question what you like to call them, because it used to be summering gray whales. It used to be seasonally resident gray whales. And it was actually someone at NOAA that called them Pacific Coast Feeding Group, PCFG, which ended up being the term we now use just because some of the work we do is funded by NOAA. But has your terminology evolved, and what do you like to call? Because, we're going to talk about the sounders in a second, but, what Jim documented and what we're talking about here are a slightly different group of whales that, feed in the Pacific Northwest and continue feeding through the summer and fall, rather than moving on like some of our sounders do.
No, for years, without even thinking about it, I mean, as you just stated, I mean, these whales sort of flew under the radar for a long time. I mean, there just really wasn't much interest in, other than, a note here and there. And it was, I think, they were either too young or too old or too sick or too late, to do what all the other whales did. And so they were here. And I think when, by pure sort of luck and coincidence and circumstance, we sort of ran across the same whale a couple times. So, all of a sudden there are a whole bunch of questions which weren't there previous to that. I have, without thinking about it, we always called them summer residents, and it just, for us, that's who they were, between the spring migration and the winter migration. I these days just call them the Pacific Coast population. I think there's enough structure there that I'm not real fond of the use of the word group or aggregation, but that's just me. And so yeah, I think half the time, most of the time, we still call them just summer residents. At least everybody here knows what we're talking about.
Yep, no, for sure. And I think what Jim hinted at there is there's been some, a great deal of politics around how to treat these whales, and both of us, but in very different ways and different contexts, have had to battle, this, I think, resistance in some quarters of recognizing them as a distinct enough group. Part of what Jim was citing of, generations of animals, born of animals that use here, kind of show that, duration of time used and the degree to which a lot of the recruitment to this group comes internally. And I think maybe because of the tough spot, maybe I'll give them more credit than you do, Jim, that NOAA, by representing the U.S. at the International Whaling Commission and managing and dealing with this, how to deal with the politics around the macaw whale hunt, and trying to get that passed, didn't want to recognize a group using the area right where the macaw were going to hunt as a distinct unit that would change kind of how they'd be treated and managed, and they wanted to keep it nice and simple. No, it's this big population. In the early years of NOAA working with the tribe to go through their process of getting approval to proceed with a hunt at the IWC, actually traded with Russia part of their quota for gray whales taken up in the Bering Sea to say, oh, they're going to reduce and they'll let us take this many, so it isn't even an added take. But all of that would get disrupted. And maybe the sympathy I had for them was the fact that they recognized that within our legal system, the macaw had a treaty right that said the right to continue sealing and whaling that would be respected. But within the IWC, the macaw were part of the U.S. And if the macaw started hunting and there wasn't permission within the IWC, the U.S. would become a pirate whaling nation, which they didn't want to do. So they were trying to sort of manage that middle ground. And the unfortunate casualties, and, I thought, and I think Jim faced this, even more directly than I did, was they became highly critical of, recognizing these, summer residents, Pacific Coast whales, PCFG. They partly came up with this Pacific Coast feeding aggregation or group because it stopped short of calling it a population or a unit. It tried to give it a more amorphous character. And I think, Jim, you faced some of the, when you and Tim Frazier first came out with genetic studies showing, genetic, unique elements that showed this was a stable long-term group, they were critical of that within, IWC in ways that were really unfair and incorrect.
Yeah. Let's talk about something else.
You don't want to go there?
I'm sort of concerned, I mean, among many things, but I was talking to Jorge yesterday and I had heard that they had 40 dead gray whales. He told me they had 80 in the last couple months. And I think that's something to be concerned about.
No, absolutely. I think, some of you know that this unusual mortality event that was declared in 2019 was declared over in 2023. And this was this period of much increased mortality in gray whales from Mexico all the way up to Alaska waters. And mortality had steadily decreased since 2019, not quite down to normal levels. But what Jim's alluding to is that, instead of seeing now a protracted period of low mortality and high birth rates that you might expect to see after this mortality event, and as occurred, after the previous unusual mortality event in 1999, 2000. Instead, this year, 2025, is turning out to see an upsurge in number of deaths. I think we've had several strandings here. There have been a number in California, and these high numbers in Mexico, and we're only in April. So at least, in the overall tally of gray whale deaths across that range, we're already exceeding the last year, 2024, and we're only in April. So we're going to see this uptick from that. And the data from the, observations of numbers of calves show those are way down as well. So this is, according to a paper that we were involved with called Boom Bust Cycles in Gray Whales, it was sort of forecasting and looking at there are these periods of high gray whale mortality and deaths, and then they seem to bounce back. And they're much bigger swings than, I think most scientists ever expected would occur in a long-lived, slow reproducing species. But now I think we're seeing something maybe that's going to be a little more serious if this continues, because there are such huge changes going on in the Arctic ecosystem. The worry would be, could these mortalities and this poor period for gray whales that started in 2019 most recently now be extending for an even longer period?
Yeah, it's certainly going to be interesting to see how the summer unfolds. But
here in Washington, our biggest period of gray whale mortality is April to June. So we're just at the start of it, and probably in the next month, we'll probably get a sense of how that's shaping up. We've already had a couple of dead gray whales so far this year.
Right. Well, so far here, the whales seem sort of happy. They're all eating away. So I think there were 20 just up the coast a little bit last week, all bottom feeding. So without any of the many, eyes from whale watchers and so on suggesting there were any problems at that point. But we will see.
To touch on one theme we've been chatting about is I do think that another demonstration of the degree of independence, and how the PCFG, are a more separate group from the group that feeds in the Arctic, is the fact that even though there's been these big swings in mortality of the overall gray whale population and big swings in the population estimates for them, we have not seen those swings in these Pacific coast feeding animals that Jim and I both study, and that kind of shows how it's driven by food resources, but also how they are independent groups. Their population dynamics are following very different cycles.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I was doing a talk the other day where I don't think the audience was realizing I was talking about the local whales or summer, whatever we're calling them. And I said that, they're pretty stable. I mean, certainly from our information, we've got basically the same whales feeding in the same locations on the same food. With some differences and some questions and some concerns, but for the most part, they seem fairly stable, which appears to be quite different than the population overall. So yeah, I completely agree with that thought. They are, well, I don't know, everything says they're a separate unit here.
One of the things we've seen in looking at the data, and I'm curious if this agrees with your observations, is that the calf production in the PCFG whales seems to have very much been in pulses. I think across the range of the PCFG, I think we're up to something like 160 or so mothers and calves documented over the years, but most of them have come from, 2 periods. And across the range in most years, in most back-to-back years, we're seeing fewer than 5 calves documented. And then there are these periods where there's more like an average of 10 or more that are being born. And those periods last 3, 4, or 5 years. And there's just 2 of them, that we've seen. And one of the interesting things, I've been working with a group at Oregon State University who's tried to, where this is with Enrico Pirata is the lead person, and Lee Torres is involved in it. They've been trying to model some of the gray whale population dynamics and bringing in things like their body condition, centered largely on some of the work they've done in Oregon starting around 2016, but some of the same whales, we see in other parts of the range. But their study only started in 2016. And that was the last year of the last pulse of gray whale births that we saw. And so their population models were all coming out with, this is a declining, dying population, if you will. And I kept feeling like, well, no, it's just you're looking at it in too short a period. And this is the same group, Casey Burlick, that did that study, that these whales are generally smaller in size than the overall gray whale population. And they're kind of putting all this together if this is a not very successful area. But I wonder if, you're kind of talking about consistency, but I wonder if you've seen any of that kind of effect we've seen, that maybe some years there are more gray whales and some years, less gray whale calves, and, any signs that tell you there is kind of more that kind of pulsed effect.
It's a great question. I've not sort of, looked at it that way, but I suspect that it's within our, data set. We could certainly ask that question. And there's just, there's no question that some years we see a whole bunch of calves and other years we don't, but it's never really occurred to me, my general feeling is, well, they're just somewhere else, rather than here. So I think there's just about in everything we look at, there's sort of, 2 potential answers. What we're seeing is something which is really happening, or what we're seeing is whatever's happening is happening somewhere else. So that's where the larger picture is much more important in many ways than the smaller area that we've been looking at. But the other issue we have with calves, and it is that, well, there's 2 of them. I mentioned one is that whales could be having calves and they could be weaned before we actually see the mothers. So, you really have no way of knowing, which mothers gave birth in a lot of cases, or at least being sure. And I've actually looked at that really carefully, and found that, a lot of the mothers or whales we know to be mothers, we don't really run into them until, middle of August, which, and then we see them every day, until November or something like that. And we just have no way of knowing if they had a calf and weaned it in early August or not.
Right. I think we tried to, it was very simplistic. We took all the cases where, mothers were seen across the season, with a calf initially and then without a calf, and then we basically, where we had that transition, we just took the midday halfway between those two dates. And I think we ended up coming up with something like mid-July as a mean weaning time. There were calves seen into August and much later, but it looked like with other examples. And we couldn't really separate weaning from necessarily, usually if the calf was recited, we know the calf didn't die, but there were cases where the calf wasn't recited, so we weren't sure of all the particulars. But would mid-July sound like a reasonable time period from what you've seen?
Yeah, I think we have we've done a similar thing. And yeah, I mean, I would have said a little bit later in July, but July. And we've, I think, actually, seen, I don't know, presumably is weaning occur where a mother is with a baby, one day or calf one day and has been for several weeks. And literally 2 days later, we find the calf by itself and the mother 35 miles farther away. And so, and that was right around the end of July. So, but certainly, as you say, we see, a few mothers with calves into early August, but by the end of August, not really. So,
Right.
um,
Yeah, no, I like that there's at least a rough agreement there because you're probably getting the feeling, Jim has this much more intensive study, that I think has much kind of more consistent coverage, in a particular area. And we're piecing together kind of data from a much broader area, but it's much more scattershot and less intense in those areas. And it'd be kind of interesting if those kind of very different types of data sets come to similar conclusions. But
it would be interesting, and I don't know the answer to this, but we know that there's probably a fairly high mortality rate of calves, or there just generally is in most mammals. So that first year is pretty much hard to get through. And what percentage of those calves that we see here? And the question is, do the calves return to this area or do they go elsewhere? Which, getting into the politics of it all and getting right back out again, is it's very hard to judge that. I mean, we certainly have calves which return, no question, and then they have calves. And so, on the other hand, if somebody claims that some of the calves that are here are never seen again, and maybe they go somewhere else, well, maybe there's no way to know that, or they died. There's no way of knowing that. So,
I'm trying to remember it. I don't have it at the top of my mind, but I want to say it's something like 50-60% of the calves we see, with a mother, past June 1st, that are, likely part of this, feeding group, are then cited in subsequent years, which I think would be pretty consistent with a mortality rate, a first year survival rate, for gray whales, and would suggest that, most, if not all, are in fact staying here and becoming part of this group here. The bigger mystery for us, and I wonder if you've gotten any insight into this, has been we do have new animals that we, if you will, join this group, and often they're smaller. And what we don't know is, are those calves of PCFG moms that we just didn't see them early enough that they were together, or are they external recruits? And that's what seems to, matter for, part of the assessment by NOAA and part of their reason they cited when they did this assessment of why they weren't treating this group of whales as a distinct unit, was that because we couldn't nail down this internal versus external recruitment question. And we were pretty convinced that, we had this, 50-60% internal recruitment that we knew was there. And the rest we actually thought might just be animals we just missed as calves, because we didn't see them, as you pointed out, sometimes till August or September is the first sighting. So you wouldn't expect to have seen them with their mom. And in fact, they were. And that's where, I know it had been an intent of NOAA, and I don't know if you've done anything on this front, Jim, at all, with your work with Tim or others, was to try to assign genetically those calves to see if they, were the offspring of some of the known mothers of the Pacific group that we just didn't see them together, but genetically you could identify that they were offspring. And they
Yeah.
just have not completed that study, at least at the NOAA end, and I don't know if anyone has with you.
No, we haven't done it. I think that's a good question. I need to talk to Tim about it, but I don't think in general we biopsy young calves. So, um, so we don't really have that
Right.
potential, I guess, until they're a year or two old, I suppose. I could ask Tim. They may well be, that information may well be there in his
Right.
data, but I can ask him.
Well, let me know if there's a way to help make that, give Amy Lang a, encouragement or ability to look at that, because I think you were part, and we were part of that effort to collect samples, biopsy samples. That was like, I want to say 7, 8 years ago. And it was largely for that purpose, and it hasn't really been fulfilled.
Right. Right. Yeah. Lots of questions.
Right. Maybe I'll stop and just look to the Orca Network organizers here and see how they'd like us to proceed.
So you had a presentation of your own, John? too?
I had an update on the Sounders, but I
Okay.
enjoyed this dialogue. Is really interesting for me. And
Well-
I'm happy to continue on this, or just switch that, or I could even give that verbally, tell you the truth, and not show any slides.
Well, I think now might be a good time to pause for some Q&A from our studio audience as well as our virtual audience. So again, if you are here in the Langley Whale Center live, please raise your hand if you have a question and we'll pass the microphone to you. Okay, I'm coming up from behind here.
Yeah, I was wondering if the whales you referred to, the grays in Puget Sound and those around the southern part of Vancouver Island, in that general area, are they coming back to the same place every year, or do they occasionally go all the way up to Alaska and feed up there? Or is it a group that returns over and over again to the same feeding range?
I might start on that, and I'll say yes and yes. And at least the pattern that we've seen is, it's, a fairly consistent group, but even within this range of Northern California to Southeast Alaska, there seem to be preferences. I think Jim can speak to like the numbers he was referring to, animals that, regularly use, the area he studies, or we have animals that prefer Northern California and Southern Oregon. But we also do have the few exceptions. Some of these gray whales that we see year after year have been sighted, up in Kodiak, one as far as into the Arctic, in 1 year. So they don't, they occasionally go farther, but I think the surprising piece and the important piece is their loyalty. I'll let Jim give his perspective on that.
Oh, no, I just agree. I think exactly. There seem to be, they seem to have preferences. That's, I think, exactly the right word, where you've got the same whales returning to the same subsection of coast year after year after year. But you also get, whales which you see 1 or 2 years, with a 10-year gap in between, and they're either elsewhere, in the southern range, or they've gone somewhere else. I think one of the more interesting things, and you probably know this, you probably know the details of this more than I, because I'm just trying to remember, but one of the tagged whales that I believe Mate did, but I'm not exactly sure who did it. But it was one of the local whales, and it went all the way up to Southeast Alaska. At the time when the herring spawn was occurring, later and later and later, and I'd almost bet it was just following the herring spawn. And then after that, it came right back to, the Vancouver Island area, or, the southern range, wherever that would be. And so it just doesn't surprise me that, especially with this herring, spawn situation where you're getting hundreds of whales, feeding on both the eggs and the larvae, that they tend to follow them up the coast. But
Yeah, no, I think there's been that tagging. There was some of the limpet tagging of gray whales that John Ford did that turned out to be a bunch of these Pacific coast feeding animals, but they thought they were tagging just migratory animals. And there have been some sightings that have really suggested many of these whales actually do start to the north. So they're coming from the breeding grounds to the south. They're actually working their way up the coast in the spring. And then they're coming back south in the summer, and showing up in some of these areas. And I think that likely has to do with the timing of things like herring spawn that Jim's alluding to, that they're trying to take advantage of.
I mean, say I have no
One quick
proof.
question. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, no, continue. Sorry.
Well, I just wondered, before you started studying these things carefully, you mentioned there's been fluctuation in the whale population. Do you have any way to look at that going back decades or centuries and see how much it's fluctuated?
I think the larger population, there's certainly data in that regard, but I have no way of looking at the local population, beyond we're before the time that we started. There's certainly, we know there were whales here, but I don't have any idea of relative numbers.
Right. With your long-term perspective, going out in, say, July or August in the last couple of years, would you say that would be pretty similar to what you would have seen in the mid-70s?
Well, I think it's a tough question, and only because the food availability is so variable. And I think that's, for the most part, natural variability. And the whales are where the food is. So you can go out some, days in July and all the whales are, spread up and down sort of within 30 miles in either direction, which is fairly typical. Or you can go out other days in the middle of July and find zip, because the whales have all, there's, for whatever reason, the plankton, which they usually eat at that time of year, either isn't happening here and it's happening elsewhere. And that's where the whales are. So I think, there are times when you think, oh my God, where are the whales? And then, of course, late August rolls around and they all show up to start bottom feeding. So, last year was an interesting year where for most of the summer, there were no whales here, but by saying none, I mean, there were one or two, but the ones that were here were passing through. But there were a ton of whales farther south, as I'm sure you know. So, yeah, it's a interesting question. In our case, the whales here in midsummer have to do with whether or not mysids and crab larvae are here.
Okay. Makes sense.
And that's one thing that comes up all the time. Another question, and it's almost, you get frustrated because you can't answer it, is that, if the whales aren't here, does it mean there's no food here? Or does it mean there's lots of food here, but there's better food somewhere else?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, it
You know
always
which
is.
one it is, right?
It always is compared to what, if you will, yes. I was going to just, in answer to that question, trying to do these mark recapture models to estimate the overall abundance that comes out at about 200 to 250. We've only been able to start doing that in the late 90s. That's where there was enough coverage up and down the coast that we were getting a reasonable sample size along the entire range that these animals use. And those estimates have, I think, stayed remarkably consistent with, there are periods of, slight slow increases and periods of slight decreases. And interestingly enough, those periods of increases line up perfectly with those periods that I was talking about, higher numbers of calves being seen, and those periods of decreases match up perfectly with these periods of low number of calves. But to me, what's remarkable is the stability. And you'd think as a subgroup, it would be more volatile. If it was a subgroup of the overall population, it would be more volatile than the larger population. But if anything, the opposite is true. The overall gray whale population with these estimates based on animals migrating past California have shown these big booms and busts going with these mortality events. And this group of Pacific Coast, when you do these mark recapture abundance estimates, have remained remarkably consistent.
I'm curious about, well, with the orcas, their patterns, visibility, the chips in the dorsal fin and that sort of thing, make them somewhat more identifiable, it seems like. And I'm wondering, you mentioned that the back, that there's a ridge there, but how are you identifying the individual animals? And I imagine that has changed a whole lot from the 70s to now with possibly more technology and chips or that sort of thing. How do you identify the
You take
particular
that, Jim.
animals?
You've done it over the longest.
No, it's about as simple as you can get, really. It's skin pigment patterns for the most part. There are certainly some scars, but we've learned that the scars actually tend to disappear over a few decades, so they're not as permanent as the actual skin pigment patterns, which really, for all intents and purposes, you always get some. There's always one that changes for some reason, but almost all of them, the patterns remain stable and the same, year after year after year. And it's still, all done just by, camera and, matching, I think, by hand for the most part, although I'm sure that's changing. But,
I'll maybe comment on a couple of things. One of the things we found really valuable over the years has been, that knuckle pattern, on the back of gray whales. There's a dorsal hump, and then there's a series of small bumps or knuckles. And we've been impressed with how variable that is between individuals and how consistent that is within individuals. And we find it, regardless of lighting, you can use that with a great deal of accuracy to match animals. There is, several new programs to do automated matching of gray whales. None of them compete with the better human matchers, let's put it that way. One of my frustrations is most of those have not tried to use that spacing of the knuckle pattern, which I think is really diagnostic. And I think they've struggled with it because they want an automatic detection that can pick those up. And they're fairly subtle, and it's easy to get fooled by, glare or light or, an object or something like that that will kind of fool the automated detection system. But we find them, remarkably stable, especially for animals you haven't seen for a long period of time that may have acquired new scars or other things like that. But how much do you use those, Jim?
no, I absolutely agree. If it isn't obvious who they are through their, patterns and all the rest of it, we immediately go to the knuckles on the back. So, yes.
Well, this is really a great conversation, really good questions. And if we are going to have time for John to do his Sounders update, we're going to have time for a couple questions from our online viewers, and then we're going to roll into the update so that we can know what's happening right now. So first question from Sherry. In your experience, is the orca on eastern North Pacific gray whale calf predation figure still 30%? And what about Pacific Coast Feeding Group calf predated figures?
I might just say we did a graduate student working with us, Enrico Corsi. We did a paper comparing the orca scars on the flukes of different whale species, including gray whales. And, gray whales were certainly fairly prevalent with having scars showing that survived a killer whale attack. But, even the blue whales had scars on them from killer whale attacks. I think gray whales along with other large baleen whale species do face that predation threat. From that measure of survival, it's hard to measure, what the overall success rate is and how many are actually being killed or taken. So I don't have anything to reflect on the 30% figure.
All right, there's one more question in chat or in Q&A that is a pretty long detailed one about a research paper. So I'm going to try to paraphrase this and get your thoughts on it. This is from Will Anderson, and he's talking about the recent paper, Isotopic Composition of the Eastern Gray Whale Epidermis Indicates Contribution of Prey Outside Arctic Feeding Grounds. And during, in part of this, they're talking about in the abstract how benthic amphipods from the Bering Sea were not the primary for the eastern gray whale. And I'm kind of trying to paraphrase this. Prey from Vancouver Island were generally as important as that from the Bering Sea. And moreover, model results indicate a constant use of Ojo de Liebre Lagoon as a feeding ground. So kind of wanting comments from you on that and wondering if there are other studies that build on this paper that had a smallish sample size that apply to the coastal feeding aggregation and the sounders. So hopefully that made sense.
I know I remember reading that paper, and I'm forgetting the details of exactly which samples they were basing it on to kind of think through. If I can just vaguely recall, I think my concern was, about how representative the sample they had was in terms of trying to extrapolate to the overall gray whale, population. And that's what, I remember kind of trying to sort through on that paper. And I forget the answer because it was a while ago. Do you know? You recall anything on that, Jim?
No, I mean, I don't recall the details, but there's no question that the migrants that are heading further north are feeding on the way north. I mean, they're feeding all along Vancouver Island. And so it certainly wouldn't be surprising to what's the word? Find that there's a variety of sort of prey items. I'm not quite sure what, I don't know if I quite understand the question in the sense that, were there samples taken from the Arctic, and did they find that benthic amphipods were not the primary food up there? Is that your understanding?
Yeah, that's what I'm not recalling, unfortunately, Jim.
There's one paper I've forgotten, gosh, which talks about some sampling which was done, I think, in the Aleutians to find that, in fact, there was a variety of plankton that were being utilized rather than benthic amphipods. So I think there's a lot of questions about exactly what they're feeding on up there, even though, stomach contents from years past certainly do indicate it's primarily benthic amphipods. But I'm sorry, I don't think I can really answer the question.
I think there's a really good point you made in there, though, which is, Jim was referring to the herring spawn, and the animals taking advantage of that herring spawn that occurs, coast of Vancouver Island up into Southeast Alaska, and other areas. Those are those aggregations of animals that go in and feed. And this is in the spring prior to when we define the presence of this Pacific Coast feeding group, and more lines up with the northbound migration. Those animals consist of a lot of animals that are not known Pacific Coast feeding group animals. It's animals breaking off from the migration. Maybe a little bit of a parallel to what we have with sounders here, because that's one of the interesting things to us, that we expect that the sounders would be more integrally connected with the Pacific Coast feeding group. And there is a little bit of overlap of a couple of animals, but the surprising thing is they more represent these Arctic feeding animals that have stopped feed, and they're probably more closely to many of the animals that feed on herring spawn, in the spring period during that northbound migration. They've just extended their time here, but then many of those animals then continue to the Arctic. And then you might see that geographic signal, so that signal that's being referred to in that paper could include the sounders in some sense, because they're animals that proceed then to the Arctic and aren't part of these animals that stay in the Pacific Northwest through the summer and fall.
Yeah. I just going to add real quickly is that there is another study underway with Erin Foster at DFO here, where she is looking at stable isotopes in the in the local whales, but also in whales that are here during the migration and following the herring. So I believe she's pretty close to writing it up. So there might be a little bit more information on that soon.
Okay, thank you so much, Jim and John, for this incredible conversation. Really appreciate the depth of knowledge and information presented here. And John, if you'd like to give us our Sounders update now, please.
Sure, and I'm going to keep it really brief, if that's okay, kind of matching the time, and just share maybe a couple of new pieces of information. I'm going to actually, if you wouldn't mind, even advancing a few slides from the slides that are shown there. I've got somebody else in control, so this is wonderful. I'm letting go of control. I'll use maybe that one slide of the sounders. I think it looks like it might be slide 5, if we could go to slide 5. And I just might talk to that briefly. This is our kind of slide of sounders, gray whales, with individuals as rows. And then years going back to 1990, the first year we documented the sounders using this area. And then if it's colored in, it shows the whale was seen that year. So it's only those blank areas where it wasn't seen. And that's where you can see that pattern we've talked about before, about 6 sounders gray whales, first discovering the area in 1990-91. Then another cohort coming on around this 1999-2000 period that was associated with that previous unusual mortality event year. And then you can see all the way to the right, and the lower right are all the new whales that joined the sounders with this mortality event that started in 2019. And so the clear conclusions we've seen is these sounders whales are whales that are in poor nutritional condition, are struggling from the larger population, and are exploring and seeking new areas to feed. And having found it, they've actually, I think, learned from each other because they're highly social, often following each other into shallow waters, and the number of sounders has grown. The new elements I want to show you from this that will cut to a couple of the updates is you can see the total number of different sounders at the very bottom. That's just a new row if you've seen this. I've shown this slide just adding new years. This has 2025 in it as we know it at the moment. And you can see that, it went from, this total doesn't go over to the left because I didn't count on it as consistent effort. But the number of sounders has steadily grown. And we're already at a dozen different sounders here so far this year, even though there are probably some we haven't seen yet. It has potentially come down a little bit since the peak mortality years of a few years ago. Then highlighted on the left are our known sexes, and you'll see some in orange. And for those of you who are really into the sounders, all those ones that are highlighted are new sexes we've assigned. We had actually collected some of these going back years ago, but they just got run and analyzed. And so we have many more sexes assigned to our sounders than we did before. And the surprise in the new sexes is the sounders were really characterized by a dominance of males in the early years. And these new assignments have not brought it up into balance, but we had actually slightly more females in the latest identifications we had. Actually, looks like it was, we had 3 females and 2 males that got added. So doesn't bring it in balance, but we have now these new females that have been identified. The other kind of new news, we have some puzzling news in that some recent sightings up right in off the city of Vancouver were of whale 53 little patch, just recently in yesterday. So very recent. That's an unusual location. I'm not terribly excited positively about that, because one of the whales that we lost, Dubnuck, a few years ago, in the last year Dubnuck was seen, he started to be seen in unusual areas and looked in poor body condition and then disappeared. So I'm not great about that. And if you go down to whale 2259, one of the new whales, sex, not assigned with a name, had not been seen up here yet. She unfortunately was found dead in San Francisco Bay 3-4 days ago, something like that. Apparently looked in reasonable body condition, but apparently had signs that might have suggested ship strike or some type of thing. So those are kind of a couple of new news on some of our favorite sounders. This would sort of, just if you're kind of keeping score, there were 6 initial sounders in 1990, 91. We now are, 3 of them are still being seen these days. 3 have disappeared now just in recent years. Shackleton, Dubnuck, and Patch are the 3 that, we, became initially concerned had died, and we continue to not see them. So, so we've lost some of those whales. But, given that, I would say this sighting history shows a remarkable level of survival, given the huge fluctuations that are occurring in the overall population and mortality rate of the larger gray whale population. We continue to see out of season use. We had, what did we have? We had, again, multiple whales show up in December of this year. So that suggests to me that's about the time they should be migrating south through our area. Again, these sounders whales are whales we think go up to the Arctic, for the most part do. There are a few exceptions. So that means they would have come and into here, and then they stayed and did not migrate down to Mexico. And now that's a pattern going back to 2020, 21 that we've seen from a handful of whales, 2 to 4 whales each year, showing up early December or January. And that pattern seems to be continuing. And it would make sense, given the low reproductive rate of the overall animals, that they would be putting a priority on maybe feeding rather than the virtually non-existent breeding and successful calving that's occurring with those animals. So those are most of kind of, I think, the newest pieces of news. I've been surprised this year at a couple of things, and I don't quite know what to make of it. It seemed like a lot of the sounders whales going back, the last couple of months have been primarily and most concentrated up in the north. And the north here is this very small, in our very small geographic scope of area, meaning that, Penn Cove to Skagit area had been the concentration of gray whale use. And that's an area we saw hardly ever used in the early years. And then we saw increasing use, I want to say going back about 5 or 6 years ago. But I'd never seen it to the degree that seems to have occurred in the early part of this season with most of the whales up there. And it seemed like one of the few exceptions was Earhart, still seemed to be sticking to that Hat Island, Snohomish River Delta area, even though when most of the whales were up north. And now, going back, I want to say a week or two, that now seems to have flipped. And now it seems like, on the way here, I saw 3 or 4 whales off Hat Island, again, right off the Snohomish. The last survey a week and a half ago, most of the whales were in Saratoga Passage. And one of the only 2 whales we saw up north was Earhart. So she had gone from I think she kind of flipped. So it really puts an interesting highlight on some of the work Hannah Clayton is doing. That's the PhD student at Stanford that has been doing a lot of work sampling intertidal areas, looking at ghost ship density. And unfortunately, she's had to focus on 5 or 6 study sites. And I'm sure now she's thinking, God, I wish I had a study site up north. I wish I had a study site everywhere to look at, what's going on with the ghost shrimp abundance to know if that's tied to that. I think that's the biggest, highlights I was going to cover with the other slides, and I can address most of them.
Okay.
Since I think we're.
Thank you, John. We're going to go ahead and open up the Q&A for just a few minutes with a question from Susan Berta, Orca Network's Executive Director.
Hi, thank you so much to both of you. It's been great hearing from your decades of dedicated research. And especially Jim, I know we've been trying for years to get you to come and give a presentation, and I hope we can have you come back and do a humpback talk for us at one of our workshops. So we really appreciate you finding the time to join us today. My question for both of you is with the recent federal funding cuts on this side of the border and the chaos NOAA fisheries is facing, and all of us wondering if we're going to really get the grants that we may have been awarded or continued contracts. How is that going to affect your research, and how might it affect things like samples that might be needing to go across the border for testing, or the sharing of research, ongoing research studies? I know a lot of things are up in the air, but just wanting you to share any impacts on your research or thoughts you might have.
And I can start with that. It's probably bigger on me than, here's a case where, sometimes I know in past years, Canadian researchers have wished their government spent more on research, and the US put a fair amount into it. And now I see our roles may have reversed. I think the main point I would make about NOAA, despite the many challenges, and we alluded to a few of them earlier with NOAA, is how many different roles they play as it relates to marine mammals. They are the primary entity responsible for enforcing and managing the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act as it affects whales. For incidental harassment or anything like that, go through NOAA and are managed by them. I have a new permit currently in review. NOAA is the one who issues those permits. So I'm worried about the cuts. One of the people I knew that worked in the permit office was one of the temporary, or probationary employees that was let go. They're going to struggle to process and get through permits. Many people might not realize that, we have a whole network of national marine sanctuaries on the West Coast, from the Olympic coast down to the Gulf of the Farallones, Monterey Bay, Channel Islands. All of those are managed by NOAA. This whole sanctuary system is under NOAA. They probably fund 60, 70% of the work we do, whether that's on gray whales, humpback whales, blue whales, the work Robin Baird does in Hawaii with different odontocetes. That's all, through NOAA. So there's, and I don't think I've touched all of the ways that NOAA is involved in marine mammal work, and it is such a, I think any given week, I'm probably having a half dozen calls with different NOAA people on different topics. And man, those calls, have been painful and grim in the last 2 months. That almost every call has to begin with who's been let go or, fired, due to their status, and now isn't in the group. Almost every participant is unsure about their job going forward. There's a major effort to organize what's called a take reduction team to reduce entanglements of whales and fishing gear on the West Coast. That whole take reduction team is managed by NOAA, and that future is in question, and no one quite knows what's going to happen there. I'm used to on these calls being the one, we're the ones on soft money, and we've got to struggle to find our funding. you guys are the ones with the stable jobs. Well, that role are now reversed. I feel like I'm the one stable, and the people I'm talking to at NOAA, that partly are there thinking they had, a stable long-term position. They don't know if they're going to be there next week. And that is just, tragic. We've tried to think of ways, there are databases and other websites that contain data that I know are no longer accessible. We don't know the fate of that. We learned early on that like things like Google Doc accounts or other things that people had maybe stored data in if they were set up, under a NOAA.gov, and that person was let go, that account disappears. So there are many ways that that's, I'm concerned about that, and that has far-reaching consequences. And I could go on, but maybe I'd be interested to hear what it must feel like on your side of the border.
Yeah, what can I say? I mean, there's a great deal of uncertainty everywhere. Certainly, the work we've, the reality has been, whether it's been good or bad, is most of our funding over the years has come from, private sources. Usually that means you have a lot less than, what's coming from government sources. But I think certainly I think it's everywhere. I was going to say it's more the case in Hawaii than here, but, a lot of the folks that have given donations and have privately supported the work over the years are simply putting things on pause, not sure what's going to happen next. So although the kind of impact is a little bit different than what John's talking about, the impact's there for sure. I think in Tofino itself, we're, cross my fingers, but, as long as the tourists keep coming and the whale watching folks continue to support our work, we're probably going to be able to continue here, at least at some level. So, but I definitely hear John on, in Hawaii, they're talking to the sanctuary folks. I mean, it's bizarre. So, guess we'll have to wait and see.
It's a bit of a grim note for us to end on, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's see, let's think of a,
Well, we are at 1:30, and I know you've got a film crew waiting for you, John, but I'm wondering if we could have time for just one more question from the audience here in the Whale Center. I saw a hand up front here earlier.
happy question.
Well, I got to give it back if it's supposed to be a happy question. No, it's a real quick one. I was just wondering, because I don't have any background in it. As far as the mortality rate of the calving, what's the odds it fluctuates with the predators on the calves? That's basically what I was wondering. What kind of predators do they have? Shark, orcas, stuff like that. If they are losing a food source somewhere else, will they?
Well, two quick points I can make. Certainly orca are the biggest predator, for gray whales that they face. And, the big killer whales, in our area, there are what we used to call transient killer whale or mammal-eating killer whales on the West Coast. Those populations have done extremely well. And you see reports from around the world. I actually did an interview for ABC Australia yesterday, radio, that because they were talking about observations of killer whales attacking blue whales in Australia, and there they've seen in areas off Perth an increase in the number of attacks on calves of humpback whales and now blue whales as well, as those populations have become larger. Baleen whales, I think the predators numbers have increased as well, and the value of specializing, on things like gray whale calves or other large whale calves becomes more advantageous. So I think there is a response occurring that way. That said, I'll just want to quickly make the point that these major mortality events that we've seen, those are food related. And that seemed to be, I think that predator piece is there and might even be growing slightly, but really the food-related dynamics are more important. Any thoughts on that, Jim?
No, I haven't had much experience with, I just haven't run into a lot of predation on the whales that we're looking at. Even though clearly, as you said, there's a lot of signs on the, from all the various ID pictures and so on, that it occurs on a regular basis, but yeah, you're right. I just think food's probably a bigger issue in the long term than predation. But
Well, maybe I'll just express my thanks to, Orca Network and the chance to talk here virtually and online. And also, I really like this format. And Jim, it's great to have a chance to, talk to you and share stories and, compare. You would think Jim and I get to talk all the time, but we don't. We need to do it more. It's something I think, enormously benefit from. And I thank Orca Network for helping to make this happen. And nice to talk to you, Jim.
Yeah, thank you so much. Oh, go ahead, Jim.
No, I just saying thank you to all.
Well, thank you so much, Jim and John, for sharing your time and your incredible knowledge. And thank you all for joining us today in person and virtually and helping us to celebrate the Welcome the Whales weekend. Thanks again.
And can I just also offer, after asking my question, I would like to encourage people to report the research that both Jim Darling and John Calambokidis do. It's a really important work, and please support their work and all of the great research that's being done. Need your help, because it's going to be some rough years ahead, whether people are dependent on federal funding or private funding, because it's not going to be there for the next how many years, we don't know, but it's going to be tough. So thanks for coming, and thanks for your support, and thanks to John and Jim. We admire all the work you do, and thank you for being there for our whales.
Thank you.